Right, I think I'm going to make a start. So welcome to the second session of the Academy Online Psychology and Democracy. This is a book club short on Lady Chatterley, well, Nature and Psychology in D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover. I'm reiterating that because I'm worried that some people might be expecting a discussion on behaviorism or advertising, and they might be a little bit disappointed to be plunged into the depths of East Midlands erotica. Now, my name's Tim Black. I'm the books and essays editor at the online magazine Spiked. And to talk about Lawrence's almost notorious classic, I'm pleased to introduce Ella Whelan, who's the co-convenor of the Battle of Ideas Festival. She's a journalist and author she's the author of a book called What Women Want, which is a very almost Laurentian title in itself. Now, Ella's going to speak for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll take the conversation out to the virtual floor. Now, as I'm sure you're well aware now, to indicate you want to speak, use the raise hand function, which is in the participants list, at the bottom of the participants list. Now, I think without further ado, we'll let Ella speak, and I'll try to unmute her, or perhaps she might be able to unmute herself. She has done. She has that much power.
Yes, hello everyone, and thank you to the BOI for putting on this. I always look forward to the Academy because it's a great week away among other things, but without that not being possible, this online version is very good, and thanks to Jacob for that great introduction. So as Tim says, I'm going to delve into the world of Lawrence and Rugby Hall and Tevershall, and try and basically throw out a few ideas and questions about how we can relate this book and Lawrence's ideas to the broader theme of the Academy. So he begins the book by talking about this tragic age that we are all tragically inhabiting, and that age for the characters of Lady Chatterley's Lover is 1920. He's writing just after the First World War and just before the real boom of modernism and the excitement of the 20s that's going to come. In fact, the Daily Mail at the time in 1922 writes that this is really the first post-war year marked by a royal wedding. So 1920 that Connie and Clifford are living in is this kind of filled with possibility and dread and fear, and it's not quite recovered from the First World War yet. So they're still hanging in that shadow. Married couple, Connie and Clifford, are tired, decrepit, and damaged relics of an age that's about to breathe its last. Connie says, "The cataclysm has happened. We are among the ruins. We've got to live no matter how many skies have fallen." And of course, the world around the Chatterleys is changing. It has changed, even in 1920, and they're struggling to keep up. Clifford, Lord Chatterley, who's returned paralysed from the waist down from the war to pursue what Lawrence calls, very favourably, the bitch goddess of fame by means of really quite, it's insinuated, mediocre but popular stories. Clifford begins the novel as this archetype of the old immovable aristocrat refusing to engage with the quite obvious level of destruction reached upon his world. And there's a great scene in which he sits in his mechanized chair, which is constantly faltering and chugging along the path through the grounds of his stately home, up on the hill of a woods, exclaiming to Connie, "This is the old England, the heart of it, and I intend to keep it intact." But of course, this is futile. Connie and Clifford are already standing looking at a patch of the woods that Clifford's father has ransacked for timber in the war. And Connie remarks that she can hear the hooters from Stack's Gate, the local colliery, that Clifford can't, he's sort of ignorant to, is refusing to listen to. He's being mocked. The old England he's pining after or pretending to protect really no longer exists. And Connie too is behind the times. She's not a flapper girl, but a ruddy kind of almost squat Scot. And Lawrence loves the word ruddy almost as much as he loves the word buttocks, actually. And she's constantly being described as this kind of ruddy country girl. She says she's supposed to have a rather good figure, but she was now out of fashion, a little too female, not enough like an adolescent boy. And as their life at Rugby progresses, with Clifford writing his stories and Connie engaging in what Lawrence calls the life of the mind with him, editing and transcribing his notes and finding intimacy in that side, rather to supplement their obvious lack of sexual intimacy because of his crippling. Connie's ruddy country girl charm begins to wilt. This life of the mind isn't sufficient. She becomes ill-looking and thin. And again, Lawrence, always the charmer when it comes to women, describes her breasts at one point as unripe, a little bitter, without meaning, hanging there. What every woman wants to hear. So this is the horror of the modern world of mechanization and industrialization for Lawrence. We've completely lost touch with the body, the desire, the natural. And when taking a drive through the local area, Connie is on her own and she's looking out at Tevershaw and remarks that the England of today is, as she says, producing a new race of mankind, overconscious in the money and social and political side, on the spontaneous, intuitive side, dead, but dead, half corpses, all of them. It was all underworld. And for Lawrence, the advent of technological development, the growing threat of the masses as a political force, all these things are sort of very, not just frightening, but horrific. I mean, he's writing Lady Chatterley's Lover in 1928, thereabouts, you know, after the 1918 Representation of the People Act, after the Irish War of Independence, the Russian Revolution. There's things happening like mass engagement of the publics in politics is increasing, newspaper circulation's growing rapidly. You know, the Daily Mail that I've already mentioned is reaching mass circulation just before the turn of the century. So democracy and politics and all this swimming mass of new engagement in the hands of the masses is just no good thing for Lawrence. In his eyes, it's only going to chew them up and spit them out and make them half dead, dead inside, and inhabit this kind of underworld. And then, of course, there's the First World Wars I've already mentioned. In a 2006 introduction to the book, Doris Lessing claimed that, you know, rather than being about a love story, a bawdy love story, as Lady Chatterley's Love is often known as, it is actually, in her eyes, the most powerful, one of the most powerful anti-war novels ever written. And I mean, maybe that's overstating it, but certainly the means of warfare at the time had upset Lawrence greatly. There's an article that he writes in August 1914 after watching a battle scene, and he says, "What work was there to do? Only mechanically to adjust the guns and fire the shot. What was there to feel? Only the unnatural suspense and suppression. A machine which, for aught we knew, was killing our fellow men whilst we stood there, blind, without knowledge or participation, subordinate to the cold machine. This was the glamour and glory of the war. Blue sky overhead and living green country all around. But we admit it all, apart in some iron insensate will. Our flesh and blood, our soul and intelligence shed away, and all that remained of us a cold, metallic adherence to an iron machine. There was neither ferocity, nor joy, nor exultation, nor exhilaration, nor even quick fear, only a mechanical, expressionless movement." He's often quite wordy, Lawrence. But you can see there that you know, what really has affected him is the disassociation involved in warfare, that you're actually no longer sticking a knife or a bayonet into anyone, you're just managing machinery, and that's the kind of horrific thing about it for him. And in Lady Chatterley's Lover, Lawrence is kind of constantly making these kind of political interventions via his characters. And when hearing that the miners at Tevershaw were talking again of a strike, Connie thinks to herself that it was not a manifestation of energy, it was the bruise of the war that had been in abeyance, slowly rising to the surface and creating the great ache of unrest and stupor of discontent. The bruise was deep, 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 the bruise of the false and human war. It would take many years for the living blood of the generations to dissolve the vast black clot of bruised blood deep inside their souls and bodies. And that basically the stoppage of lifeblood, you know, the clotting, the stagnation of our inner vitality is this thing that has to be remedied for Lawrence. It's, you know, basically the war and the kind of encroachment of machines and mechanization on life has caused us to clot up and stop working. And this is one of the ways in which this is most evident in the work, is obviously around the impotence of Clifford and the notions of sex. This is where kind of sex comes in. Clifford and his friends are constantly talking about the life of the mind and the idea that, you know, as they put it, sex is a sort of communication like speech. You know, there's nothing more to it, nothing so special about it. Tommy Jukes, who's this kind of quite interesting character of someone who's both very masculine and attractive to Connie, but also kind of completely cold and empty to her, says, I just simply can't vibrate in unison with a woman. There's no woman I can really want when I'm faced with her, and I'm not going to start forcing myself to it. My God, no, I'll remain as I am and lead the mental life. It's the only honest thing to do. I can be quite happy talking to women, but it's all pure, hopelessly pure. And Connie's sitting in the corner as he's saying this, sewing, and thinking to herself, you know, that she once did find it very exciting to live this life of the mind with men. You know, she says, it was fun. Instead of men kissing you and touching you with their bodies, they revealed their minds to you. It was great fun. But she's now come to the realization of, but what cold minds, you know, and she actually even says to Tommy Jukes at one point, there are some nice women, you know, some women and men do still like each other, and he rubbishes this. As Lawrence writes, this turgid, unnatural, stultified world would need new hope, and Connie does, that's Connie's word. She says at the start of the book that it needs new hope. And this comes in the form of Mellors for Connie, who bursts into her world from the natural world, the wood, with a swift menace, a sudden rush of threat. And unlike Clifford, of course, Mellors doesn't have a blood clot. He can get it up. In fact, when Clifford is all in the mind, Mellors is all in the pants, even though most of the time he feels without pants in the novel. The first time they're alone together, Connie has this vision which Connie has this vision which hits her in the middle of her body, in her womb. You know, think vitality, life, loins, lots and lots of loins in Lawrence. Coming upon Mellors having a wash around the back of his cottage in this very vulnerable state where she's watching him like an animal. She saw the clumsy breeches slipping down over the pure, delicate white loins, the bones showing a little, and the sense of aloneness of a creature purely alone overwhelmed her. Perfect, white, solitary nudity of a creature that lives alone and inwardly alone. And beyond that, a certain beauty of a pure creature, not the stuff of beauty, not even the body of beauty, but a lambency, the warm white flame of a single life revealing itself in contours that one might touch. A body. And it's this final kind of epiphany, a body that represents the hope that Lawrence has for this tragic world. Vitality, however quenched and frail it might be, as Connie notices that Mellors is somewhat, is present in him where it is absent in all other aspects of her life. But of course, because Lawrence is no lover of democracy or agency or anything that I might think is progressive about the shifting times that he's writing in, for him, this life force is forced upon the two lovers by fate or will or something that's really other than their own. In a review of Lawrence's poetry, a book of Lawrence's poetry, Terry Eagleton is really rather disparaging of him, really trashes Lawrence basically, and he says, life for Lawrence is not the empirical existence of this kangaroo or that gamekeeper, Mellors. It is an enigmatic, utterly mysterious force which speaks us far more than we speak it. It is at root quite indifferent to human beings and will have its own sweet way with them, whatever their projects and desires. Mellors, the gamekeeper, makes no attempt to resist his sexual feelings for Connie Chatterley in the fatalistic assurance that they must inexorably take their place. When life grabs hold of you in Lawrence, often by the balls, you must simply look on wonderingly as though it were all happening to somebody else. And I mean, you know, I think there's a lot in that, and it's interesting or notable that, you know, there is just no question of Mellors resisting his urges for her, even though he actually really despises the world that Connie comes from and despises her at times. The flicker in his loins means that they're straight to it. Connie and Mellors, even at times, actually completely lose their minds altogether. They are taken place by John Thomas and Lady Jane, which is their pet names for their forget-me-not strewn genitals, which occasionally are in conversation with each other. I mean, the book ends with Mellors' penis signing off to Connie's vagina when he says, John Thomas says goodnight to Lady Jane, a little droopingly, but with a hopeful heart. And in one of his rants about the upper classes and money and commerce and the dirty world, Mellors relates the problems with this world with the fact that the root of sanity is in the balls, he said. And the problem is that most men, like Clifford, for example, are now ball-less. He says their spunk is gone dead. Motor cars and cinemas and aeroplanes suck that last bit out of them. I tell you, every generation breeds a more rabbity generation with India rubber tubing for guts and tin legs and tin faces, tin people. It's all a steady sort of Bolshevism, just killing off the human thing and worshipping the mechanical thing. Money, money, money. All the modern lot get their real kick out of killing the old human feeling out of a man, making mincemeat out of the old Adam and the old Eve. You know, there's vitality and life coming back into it. They're all alike. The world is all alike. Kill off the human reality. A quid for every foreskin, 2 quid for each pair of balls. What is cunt but machine fucking? It's all alike. Pay them money to cut off the world's cock. Pay money, money, money to them. And that will take spunk out of mankind and leave them all little twiddling machines. And Connie sat there like, whoa, okay. And he's gone on this huge rant. And of course, the antidote is to come back to nature. And she tells him that there's, after he said this, she says, you know, there is another truth. And she's saying this while she's gathering his balls in her hands. And to bring him out of this despair, she decides to run out into the rain naked, you know, to completely reconnect in that kind of very visceral, animalistic way. When she's pulling off her clothes to do this, she takes his breath away, takes the life out of him, and he notices her pointed, keen animal breasts, which tipped and stirred as she moved. So they're no longer bitter and meaningless, these breasts. They're now full of meaning and life and vitality. You can see why feminists like Kate Millett and others weren't so keen on Lawrence. You know, Connie is all haunches and posterior and animalistic, and of course after she goes out in the rain he takes her, which is the sort of the mastery of man in Lawrence. But for Mellors, her body and their sexual connection is the antidote to this modern life that he so abhors. He says, if I only live 10 minutes, I'm not going to do a broad accent here, so forgive me. Says, if only I lived 10 minutes and stroked thy arse and got to know it, I should reckon I'd lived one life. See there, industrial system or not, here's one of my lifetimes. And yes, Connie's got a great backside. She herself remarks about her long sloping haunches, but it's this idea, this assertion of reclaiming the corporeal. You know, Lawrence is all about getting back to the truth of sex and what it means, and the hope of returning man and woman to some kind of creative state, breathing life back into the damaged, soot-covered England by means of this sort of very basic desire. And Lawrence, through Mellors, is prophetic at times. In his last letter to Connie, Mellors says, there's a bad time coming, there's a bad time coming, boys, there's a bad time coming. If things go on as they are, there's nothing that lies in future but death and destruction for all these industrial masses. But the thing he believes in is, but you know, and obviously Lawrence is relating this to, because he's writing in 28, the fear that's in the interwar period. It's also reminiscent there of that repetition in Mellors from T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, and this deep-seated fear of what's to come. You know, that section in it that says, my nerves are bad tonight, yes, bad, stay with me, speak to me, why do you never speak? Speak, what are you thinking of? What thinking, what, I never know what you're thinking, think. And the fear is, as you know, Yeats wrote, that rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouching towards Bethlehem to be born. So what to do about this? And for Mellors, at the end of Lady Chatterley's Lover, the thing that he believes in is, as he writes to Connie, you're being with me. A man has to fend and fettle for the best, and then trust in something beyond himself. You can't insure against the future except by really believing in the best bit of you and in the power beyond it. So I believe in the little flame between us, this Pentecostal flame that he talks about. In going back to the 1914 article that Lawrence wrote, he ends it in total despair. My God, why am I a man at all when this is all, this machinery piercing and tearing? It is so unnatural as to be unthinkable. But in Lady Chatterley's Lover, this Pentecostal flame, this holy power that sex and the body can give to man and woman, but mainly man, is taking over Mellors's body in this higher power of fucking and desire and all this stuff that Lawrence talks about. And the aesthetic, this is the escape, this is the possibility of coming back to some kind of, and I think it is coming back, a kind of, there's a reactionary tone in all of it, to some kind of state before the corruption of the world through everything we've talked about. So just to finish, I mean, questions for us to think about. What does this, at times, subjugation of the mind to the body, or connection of the mind and the body, say about Lawrence's belief in agency? I mean, they, as I said before, they both do lose themselves in sex. Mellors particularly is, although feminists have talked about Connie losing her individuality, I think actually a lot of the time Mellors is described as helpless. The stream of consciousness changes direction, turning downwards. That's what it's written at one point. You know, he literally loses his brain to his balls. Clifford, predictably, is, on the other hand, is kind of disparaging about the masses, if you're talking about the kind of politics of the novel. But I think Lawrence is also speaking through him when he scolds Connie at one point for being so naive and sympathetic in a kind of a way about the quality of life of the miners. Clifford says, the masses were always the same and will always be the same. Nero's slaves were extremely little different from our colliers or the Ford motor car workmen. I mean Nero's mine slaves and his field slaves. It is the masses. They are unchangeable. An individual may emerge from the masses, in the form of Mellors, presumably, but the emergence doesn't alter the mass. The masses are unalterable. It is one of the most momentous facts of social science. I'm going to pronounce this wrong, panem et circenses, which is bread and circuses. Only today, education is one of the bad substitutes for a circus. What is wrong today is that we've made a profound hash of circuses part of the program and poisoned our masses with a little education. And I think, that's possibly what Lawrence is saying has happened to Mellors, that he has been poisoned with this little bit of education, which he can't quite... It is basically making him miserable. And we can get into this. I haven't mentioned the obscenity trial, which took place in 1959, 1960, and cemented the popular idea of Lawrence as this kind of a bawdy joke, really. Lots of the sexual imagery in the book reads like a kind of terrible Mills and Boon book, and it's in places far more homoerotic, with all the tails and haunches and asses and secret places than kind of popular understanding of it gives it credit for. There's actually this fascinating article by it's an all right article by Peter Hitchens, but there's a really fascinating bit in it where he makes the point that Mervyn Griffith-Jones, who was the prosecutor at the time of the obscenity trial, read out the whole segment of this, pissing and shitting and touching secret places and getting rid of the shame between Connie and Mellors in his closing speech, and Hitchens writes, but because Lawrence's famous candour had deserted him, because he did not use the fine old Anglo-Saxon word beginning with the letter B, buggery, which describes this act, a respectable English jury of the period probably had no idea what he was talking about. So Hitchens is arguing that actually the kind of homoeroticism of it might have been lost at the time of the obscenity trial, which is funny because it was the one thing that was illegal. But what I think Lady Chatterley's Lover is very useful in doing is revealing the inner turmoil of a shifting world. And Mellors in particular is stuck between these two worlds, a bit like Lawrence himself, come from a mining background, thrown into the war and seen the world through the war, educated, obviously smarter than his peers, but then coming back to the confines of Tevershall and not quite being able to bear going back to the mines, and so kind of hiding away in the woods as a gamekeeper, and just being kind of bitterly buffeted between these two worlds that are changing. And he's completely bitter and twisted about the ruling class and its decadent decrepitness. He talks about them having no balls, but also completely loath to join them and join the filthy rat race. He just wants to be left alone, which is a feeling that Lawrence really shares, himself being the son of a miner and a teacher, and the kind of hero worship he had of his mother, who was, as he says in one of his poems, superior was she to his father because of her relatively higher social class. He too moved from humble beginnings to become a travelled author, inhabiting that same kind of limbo land, being exiled from Britain and during the war as being suspected as a spy, never really being able to fully be accepted. And that's that kind of torture that I think is there in Mellors as well. And so this fraught, tense, prophetic moment of the interwar period, as described in Lady Chatterley's Lover, though he's given hope by them coming off together in the woods. And I don't really mean that to sound flippant. Partly what Jacob was talking about in terms of this, the search for vitality or something real and meaningful and true is there. And Connie and Mellors remain still partially protected from the dirt and grime and noise of the world, which is slowly making its way towards them. I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Ella. That was fantastic. Yeah. So, as I await some raised hands, I guess actually Ella's covered one of my questions, which was the role that sex plays in Lawrence, because it's interestingly it's not really an erotic fiction. It's not particularly titillating, and sex seems to have a kind of spiritual or almost like religious function. So I was wondering if Ella could say a little bit more about that, although she probably has said quite a lot. Another question which I think is worth exploring, is the extent to which Lawrence, and I guess other modernists of the time, but certainly Lawrence above all, because of his attempt to kind of de-shame or remove the shame from sex and the libido, the extent to which he almost anticipates parts of the counterculture and you know, that move against the repressive society, at the extent to which he actually anticipates people like Herbert Marcuse. So I think that's something to consider. Now, I believe Wendy wants to speak, so I'm going to unmute you.
Ella, really interesting and bringing out a lot. One of the things one of the things that struck me as I was reading it was, you know, who Connie is as the daughter of an artist, and her relationship kind of being kind of in between the aristocracy that she marries into and the kind of wider world that she is part of, that she was, you know, she had her love affairs in Germany before the war, and you know, she came as a kind of a free, liberated woman into a marriage that chained her somewhat. And I guess, you know, just I suppose wondering about how this adds to, or how this relates to Lawrence's sense of the world as really kind of, you know, kind of on the one hand being rescued by a return to, or a kind of embracing the natural sexuality of Mellows, but also Connie being of the artistic milieu, whether, you know, he's also making an argument at some level about the world of the arts being a kind of an antidote to the world of the aristocracy. So that although, you know, Lawrence challenges, is critical of this idea of the obsession with the mind and the mental activity, he's at the same time, you know, he does see Connie as better than Clifford, and as having an element of hope, and in his kind of narrative, or his sense of the possibilities of the future, to the extent there are any, as standing against the masses.
Ella, I was wondering, is Clifford part of the old age, or is he new? Because he seems to me like a bit of a transitional person, because at the beginning of the book, you know, the point is made that he makes fun of everything, his father including, you know, that they're always very cynical, almost like nihilistic. And even when the friends talk, you know, that scene you were talking about, when they, you know, these men, I forgot the name, she was sort of sitting by stitching and listening. It's all, you know, it's just always very, you know, he makes the point that they're ripping everything apart, but not creating anything new. So I find that interesting. The other thing is, in a funny way, you know, all the men she meets, so she's got this other love affair with this guy, Mick, beforehand, they all come through Clifford. You know, that might just be the way the book works, but you know, it's just a question. What is he? Who is he? Does he maybe represent the kind of, you know, the intellectual elite D.H. Lawrence wants to actually criticize? You know, just they are criticizing the old. At the same time, they're kind of attached to the old, you know, that forest scene, but they can't create anything new. They can't create anything meaningful.
Thank you, Sabina. We'll go to Frank, and then Jacob, and then Gareth, and then we'll return to Ella to get some feedback. Frank.
That was a really great introduction, Ella. I really liked it. When I was writing a book on the First World War, I kind of got into Lawrence because he seems to be a real transitional figure, in the sense that he appears to be overwhelmed by this sense of loss. And that's what I always get out of him, this palpable sense of loss, which very much summed up the zeitgeist that prevailed in Britain after the First World War. And at the same time, there's also, you know, the kind of reaction that he kind of promotes, that kind of very reactionary, anti-machinery, you know, anti-innovation. He sees everything that isn't simply of the earth as being dehumanizing in some sense. And he's got this very naturalistic sort of account of what a human being is, you know, almost like in a kind of biological way. And he almost comes across as if somehow he's a Nietzsche in disguise, a kind of literally disguised, who kind of resents, you know, all the glorious, you know, human heroism that used to exist beforehand. I think Clifford is very important in this respect, because Clifford does kind of personify that kind of decadent, impotent, you know, ruling class that kind of is paralyzed by their experiences, who, you know, cynically rejects things without in any way being committed to either holding on to anything from the past or making any kind of contribution. Question that I've got, which, you know, I'm not really sure about in relation to Lawrence, because he's kind of in the middle of things, he's this transitional figure, is to what extent, you know, he is steeped in the, you know, wants to kind of go back to something, or to what, because I think that he, in some sense, yearns for that, but I think at the same time he realizes the impossibility of doing that. So the question that I've got is really, to what extent is he just simply stuck in the kind of stasis of the interwar period, or to what extent he sees the possibility of, or not, because he's not a political figure, to what extent his imagination is kind of harnessed towards, you know, sort of regaining or reappropriating what has been lost.
Fascinating. Jacob, I'll just unmute you.
Yeah, hi. Again, thanks, Ella. That was great. I guess the two sort of random thoughts that come to mind. The first is that, I mean, the figure of Clifford that we're talking about a little bit. There's something that's almost like, he's almost like a sort of precursor to the incels. Like, he's like complete, not just his impotence, but also his like, he's like, there's a sense in which, like, when you read these descriptions, they themselves also feel sort of broken by modern society. They've been like worn down, broken down. They don't know what their place is in the world anymore. They've sort of given up on trying to create something new as well. And then even to the degree, like, even the degree he's got his own books and decides he likes the intellectual life, that's sort of like what they call the vol cells, or the men going their own way, the people who've sort of gone, oh yeah, well, women, we're never going to get any sex anyway, we're incels, but we're just going to sort of do it. This is like, we'll just be our own people and we'll give up on the future and we'll just watch porn and live in the present. So it's like, that was the first thing that came to me. The second thing, slightly related to some of the questions Frank just asked, was that I've always found it kind of hard to put my finger on what's positive or useful in the book, as much as it's kind of a compelling statement of a particular moment. And I mean, there's, as mentioned, there's this sort of perhaps useful or somewhat useful criticism of the old guard, and in that figure of Clifford. And I think throughout the book, there's the question that I don't really know, is like, agency or human agency has such an ambiguous position in the book, because obviously on the one hand, any kind of mass or collective or genuinely sort of transformative attempts are sort of disparaged, like the people working in the mines or whatever it is. But on the other hand, it's like you can dip out and sort of reclaim a little bit of your own agency and freedom, and that's sort of what's represented by the sort of central love stories of these two people, despite it all, sort of find a little space where they can actually reclaim their own sense of themselves and discover who they are. So it's like, that's the, I don't know what the status of agency is in the book.
Thanks, Jacob. And Gareth, and then we'll go back to Ella.
Thanks again, Ella. Absolutely brilliant. I'm interested in, well, I better confess, actually, I've never really managed to finish the book, so you have persuaded me to at least do that, so thank you for that. But if anyone's still interested in what I have to say, having to confess that, what is Lawrence's relationship to the view of Matthew Arnold then? Culture and Anarchy, and his distrust of the masses, and it's going to lead to disaster and everything else. From my half reading of it and hearing you talk, it suggests that kind of Clifford represents that sort of Arnoldian kind of character, and that Lawrence is having a pop at him too. I wonder if I've got that right. And just very briefly, secondly, where does this book stand today? Because it seems to be, to me, talking about the restraint of desire, and whilst that may have had a particular inflection in his time, I think today there is quite a different reading to that. And I mean, those who know me know that I won't ever leave a discussion without a mention of Blake. So I'm going to quote a Blake line, which is that those who restrain desire do so because their desire is weak enough to be restrained. And I wonder what the message for today's readers might be from the book.
Right, thank you, Gav. Ella, yes.
Thanks. Yeah, great points. To come back to Bean's one, of course, you're right to point out that he, he begins as this old archetypal figure, and he's really quite drained, and he's kind of given life by Connie engaging in him in this chase after the bitch goddess of fame, and the fact that he's becoming famous and it's all quite empty. But he really transitions at the point at which he begins a relationship with Bolton, because she convinces him to, through their sort of bizarre nighttime sort of it's sort of inferred that it might be somehow sexual, even though it's obviously can't be completely sexual because he's incapable of doing that. But their relationship allows him to have this sort of innovative idea to get on board with the moving technology in terms of coal mining and turn it into electricity, and he becomes this kind of great industrialist, and of course that's really what makes Connie most sick about him. She finds that really quite disgusting, and I think that's Lawrence saying that even Clifford, who is this ridiculous relic of the old world, has been corrupted by the bastardry of modern life, that even he can't leave himself alone to sit in the chair and at rugby. He has to get involved in the dirt of Tevershall, and there's this really quite great scene that I didn't mention. Part of when Connie's moving along in her car looking at the sort of the wastelands that she sees of these mining villages, she talks about the fact that the soot, these mines put the money in to build the halls of these stately homes, and now they're replacing them, and the soot is literally blotting out old England. So Clifford is the old Clifford is blotted out, and this new Clifford comes into being, who is just utterly distasteful to Connie. That's where she really starts to get turned off by him, and when she starts to find her deepened affection for Mellors. And in terms of what Frank's asking about, the difficult thing about this is that I don't have any love for Lawrence particularly, and I have to share the view that Kate Millett really takes the piss out of him in Sexual Politics, where she talks about this last sort of vision that he has. I mean, it's important that the novel ends with the letter from Mellors. So Mellors is the one going forward. Connie's away in Scotland, kind of convalescing before she gives birth to their child, and Mellors is the one who's got the power really at the end of the novel. He's robbed, even though he's not wasting away, but kind of pining away for her on a farm. And the vision is that women would amuse themselves, and they ought to learn, this is men, they ought to learn to be naked and handsome, and to sing in mass and dance in old group dances, and carve the stools they sit on and embroider their own emblems, and they wouldn't need money. And it's like, Kate Millett takes the piss out of this, being like, oh, it's like old folk England, what a load of bullshit, she says basically. And I think that the point that to tie it in with what Jacob was saying, is that really the only redemption that he finds is in this union of two people. And I don't want to underplay how quite remarkable he is at, despite the kind of one-sidedness of it occasionally, in terms of it all being about Mellors is stirring penis all the time, but the level of intimacy, the detail of the level of intimacy that he goes into, and the kind of dance that they play with each other, that they engage in, Mellors and Connie, of desire, at one point saying they don't love each other, and they do, and then I'm going to leave, and then he calls her Lady Chatterley, and it's a dig, and all of that is, I think Lawrence is incredibly successful at really getting to that, and it's in that he's sort of saying that there's a redemption. But I can't from this book draw up any kind of progressive idea that Lawrence might think of overcoming the issues, other than this rather ridiculous kind of pastoral notion. But maybe someone wants to defend him in something that I've missed, because I'm rather pessimistic when it comes to that side of it. I'll leave it there and come back to more questions.
Right, yeah, thanks, Ella. Okay, let's go for Phil, Jenny, Alka, and then Frank again. Phil.
Yeah, I'm afraid I can't be defending Lawrence either in this moment. I thought it's really interesting to me that he essentially makes the argument that the world of the mind must be exchanged for the world of the body, but he does this by writing a book, which seems a sort of fascinating contradiction. And I think that contradiction is present throughout the whole of the book. The sex in the book feels very forced. The language is almost trying to do too much because he is advocating for something that he's then abandoning by writing this book in the first place. So the language is it feels like it's constantly trying too hard. So all the fucks and the haunches and the cunts and everything, just it almost feels like sort of early rap whenever he's trying to kind of throw all these expletives out there just to get an attention. And it never really, for me, convinces. And I thought about how, I mean, this is a book that's contemporaneous with, Ulysses. Joyce's Ulysses published, 6 years earlier than this. Woolf is writing around this time. Most of James's work is already published. Henry James's work is already published by this time. And when I finished the book, I thought of these other writers and how in their work, which can be ambivalent, which problematizes the same period of time that Lawrence is problematizing, there is nonetheless this real passion for life, this real energy. I mean, Woolf has a sort of melancholic bent too, in fairness, but in her actual language, the language that she uses brings the world alive in a way that I feel Lawrence utterly fails to do. And I wonder what that's about. It feels to me that there is in Joyce, in Woolf, and in Henry James, just as those examples, there is a love of life, of the actual substance. But I think Ella mentioned this at the start, where it's almost that these figures or these characters or these industries standing in for these big ideas, the idea of a bucolic return to folk England or whatever it might be, but it's all an idea. It's not an actual love of the actual life. Joyce writes about an advertising salesman walking around Dublin for a day, but everything is so thrillingly alive. Even when Joyce writes sex at the end with Molly, the language does it all for you, whereas in Lawrence, the language is trying too hard and it's not really working. And so, yeah, I think, but the only thing I would say in his defense is I think the book, to some degree, has that almost built in because there is ambivalence within the sexual act. So he's trying to praise the sexual act as a way of escape, but there's a bit where Connie says she realized for the first time what a queer, subtle thing hate is. For the first time, she had consciously and definitively hated Clifford with vivid hate, as if he ought to be obliterated from the face of the earth. And it was strange how free and full of life it made her feel to hate him and to admit it fully to herself. And there are these little crackles where I think the truth kind of breaks through a little bit. There's the bit that kind of struck me fascinatingly, sorry to quote again, but I think it's important. He says to her after they've just, they're kind of in the act of having sex or about to have sex, anything for a bit of warm-heartedness. But the women don't like it. Even you don't really like it. You like good, sharp, piercing, cold-hearted fucking and then pretending it's all sugar. Where's your tenderness for me? You're as suspicious of me as a cat is of a dog. You love fucking all right, but you want it to be called something grand and mysterious just to flatter your own self-importance. Your own self-importance is more to you, 50 times more than any man or being together with a man. And Lawrence never actually resolves that. It's a fascinating thing to put in the middle of a book, which supposedly tells us that this is the redemptive part. This thing will redeem us. So I think, in fairness, there is that implicit critique is embedded within the book itself. It just is never given, or maybe it's never even clear to Lawrence. So yeah, I think for me, what I wrote down actually just as I finished it, I never read it before, but there's a comparison between, I think, Joyce and someone who would say life must be loved, and then where Lawrence is saying life must be fucked. That the way to approach life in other ways, thinking, how do you love life? How do you love the particularity, the messy particularity of life? But Lawrence is trying to force us to do something different, and to me, it just didn't work. It didn't convince.
Thanks, Phil. Jenny.
I think it's probably important to get away from whether one likes Lawrence or dislikes him, or loves the book or dislikes the book, because I think Ella is quite correct to sort of really concentrate on the question of the inner turmoil of people in this interwar period. But I think it's also important to remember that blasphemy trial, actually, because obviously that was about challenging his blasphemy, but that was a long time after the book. That was in the 1960s, right? But to go back to when he was writing like this, the blasphemy was very much part of what the modernists were really trying to do. He was a modernist to his heart, as far as I can see. They were really trying to challenge, get under the skin of the sort of narrow-minded morality and hypocrisy, of the Victorian age. And this sort of blatant, blasphemic sexuality, was very, very much part and parcel, of that challenge. Of course, they were also quite, this is including, Joyce and Woolf, and that they were quite elitist, an elitist group in the sense of, imagining that they had something to say, that was, perhaps a bit beyond the masses. They had something important to say intellectually. Just two other quick points. I think it's already been mentioned, the other interesting relationship in this was the relationship between Mrs. Bolton and Clifford. In fact, at one point when Connie's having a look at this and is beginning increasingly to get disgusted by it, she talks about what the nature of this relationship could be, sort of rather platonic on the one hand, and as somebody else has said, also somewhat erotic. But if you remember where that relationship goes to, Clifford becomes actually quite infantilized, even as he's becoming an industrialist. He becomes really infantilized. Mrs. Bolton becomes like a mother figure to him. And at the end of the day, she is his connection with the working class. At one stage, Connie describes her gossip as being almost like a novel, relating to, people who'd written these romantic novels. So I think it wasn't just a one relationship alone. I think he was exploring a lot of different sexual and platonic relationships, as well as, just the central point, which was the intimacy of the sexual relationship could perhaps save individuals, even if it couldn't save society.
Thank you, Jenny. We'll go to Alka, then Anne, and then Ella, if you want to come back. So let's unmute. Alka.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Ella. It's great. It's a while since I read the book. I think it is. I don't think it's out of place to say whether you like it or not. It's a book. It's an aesthetic object, and I think I don't particularly like it. And I think the reason is similar to what Phil says. So I just want to make 2 points. One is a kind of one more, if you like, an aesthetic point, which is that despite the radicalness of his content, the form of the book is actually quite traditional. It's quite in keeping with the French realism of some of the French novelists in that sense. And I think that's what gives it some of its leaden quality that Phil was talking about. And I think for me, the person that, I don't think artists are always the best people to understand the full significance of their work. And at that time, I think the blaze of literary criticism that was where there was a new kind of people, the Bloomsbury set and others were involved in writing in a more public domain and arguing for books. And of course, F.R. Leavis was a main person, not on the Bloomsbury set, but he was really, I think, crucial. And I think he really understands something that's a bit different to the way it's being posed, and that it's not a kind of mind-body thing. he's talking about the importance of experience, and that experience isn't just the experience of body, but his thing was, I mean, Lewis championed both T.S. Eliot and D.H. Lawrence, two very different types of writers. And his point was that it was, you know, culture was the site of regeneration. On that they were all agreed, the Bloomsbury set and Lewis. And it couldn't be the people who had been in charge of it, because they had patently failed. They had failed politically, socially with the strife of the classes, the war, and in terms of the actual cultural forms, it wasn't happening in Britain. You know, the main innovations in art and literature were happening in France. So they were concerned with regeneration. And for Lewis, it was really, literature was crucial. And this links to a point Jacob's made on the chat, was that it was something to be experienced. It was not something to be passed and understood in an overly intellectual way, because before it had been taught more or less as Latin passing in a very kind of technical way. So he was very much for literature, and poetry in particular had to be experienced, and that was not just it wasn't just a bodily thing. It included the intellect, but most importantly included the imagination. And I think that in that way I would sort of see like almost like a triumvirate of Eliot, Lawrence and Lewis as providing some of the beginning tools in which to kind of think our way out of a situation of cultural stasis.
Thank you, Alka. Anne. Oh, I forgot. Anne, you can speak.
First of all, thanks, Ella. I used to be a total obsessive about this book back in my teenage years, before I knew anything about the political context. And I found Lawrence particularly compelling. And I think that the introduction that you've gave was probably one of the best introductions as to how to situate this novel that I have ever come across, and I found it really inspiring. So thanks very much for that. I think that the whole thinking around this novel has really been lost so much in the general popular sense that it's a novel about sex. And I think the point that you made in your introduction about how he really looks at the context of the war, the way that society is at the moment, how it might be going forward, how it has been in the past, and how he situates himself as a novelist that's really concerned with those points, has generally been really lost. And I think it is really important to situate him as a modernist writer that is concerned with what the form of society is at that time, and what writing, what the form of writing is, and what the form of the novel is at this moment. And I think that the point that's made about it being a kind of traditional novel, yes, there is that element of it being a traditionalist novel, but there's also an element that of his challenge to how a novelist can write, and its explicitness in the language and its discussion of sex is very, very new, I think, at that time. And I think that is part of his challenge, to basically say, while Joyce is exploring the form of the novel in terms of punctuation, form of sentences, form of grammar, and a whole load of stuff is going on, Lawrence is challenging in a different way. He's challenging it in terms of content. He's challenging it in terms of the way that sex can be talked about. I think it's in that context, it's important to refer back to the fact that, you know, there is a lot that is very troubled about Lawrence, and Lawrence is struggling to write about sex, which is something that when you look at the biographies of Lawrence, and you look at some of his other writing, and particularly his poetry, he's also quite troubled about himself. And he's particularly, I think, has a reputation for the way in which he looks at the relationship of men with men in Sons and Lovers, and his relationship with women, I think is something that he powerfully gets underneath the surface of. And he was troubled about the relationship between sexes. He was also had a really troubling relationship with writing. I mean, this book is really interesting, this novel, in that it ran to 3 drafts, which have then come to be published. And that he wrote it and he overwrote it and he wrote it again. And the draft that finally came to be renamed as Lady Chatterley's Lover was going to be published as John Thomas and Lady Jane. And I think that that sort of fixation of him going over and over it again was him really trying to think about how he would finally be able to express himself in that. So I think we do have to see it as being a novel that was an inventive novel of the time. It's one that, as Ellen points out, talks about far more than sexuality, as in fact far more about the way that society is moving on and how unsettling that is in terms of him experiencing his deep manhood. And I think in terms of the way that sexuality will be looked at and expressed. And finally, in terms of today, I think Jacob made the point about the incel society, but I think it's also about how we look at sex being embedded in our very being. I think that this is a novel that really looks at a different way of challenging that than most of the bollocksy feminist literature that we will ever come. Here is a man who understood what it meant to be a man, even if perhaps he didn't quite get what it meant to be a woman.
Thank you, Anne. It's a lovely sentiment to bring Ella back in.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. I mean, I think you're right in terms of, you know, there are some things that are even, you know, in 1928, as Phil said, you know, Ulysses has already been published. There's all these great works already come out there. And there's already been a huge amount of discussion about sex, but there are, you know, without wanting to make you all blush, there are points, shouldn't be underplayed, the sort of radicalness of some of the stuff that he's talking about. And I mean, he goes on this like quite ridiculous rant about lesbianism, Mellors at one point. But the discussion, there isn't a lack of discussion about female sexuality. You know, Connie goes into great depth about, especially with her relationship with Mick. The Irish don't fare very, as you know, very well, as much as women don't fare very well. This kind of gruff Mick, and how she can't come off at the same time as him, and the complications there, and all the ways in which the body parts work. And like, you know, you can't underplay how big a deal it was to talk about that then. You have to put aside what we're used to now and think about, you know, it wasn't published in Britain, but it being published in 1928 and what that meant. But I mean, what I'd counter that with is Phil has, you know, not to continuously denigrate Lawrence, but Phil's already mentioned Joyce. And, you know, in some ways, I think what's happening in Lady Chatterley's Lover and the desire to, not to normalize sexual desire, but actually to try to, you know, really elevate it. It's important that kind of the description of it as a Pentecostal flame at the end, you know, the Holy Spirit is very important. But, you know, Bloom in Ulysses talks about the fact, you know, there's scenes in which he's trying not to fart when he's looking at a beautiful girl. He's enjoying the smell of piss off his kidneys. And then obviously Molly's soliloquy at the end, which is this utterly beautiful passage. Yes, and I said yes. And it's, you know, revolutionary in terms of this closing the book in with the woman's inner thoughts and inner voice. But also it's this very warm and open and full of possibility idea of what human desire can bring about. Whereas I think the thing in Lawrence is that it always feels there's just this slight tinge of it being futile in there. You know, the very fact that it takes Connie quite a long time to unlearn the stultifiedness that she's had with Clifford to really sink into the intimacy with Mellors, but she's, you know, still doesn't quite get there. Maybe we've not got that long, but the factor of children in this is really interesting because it's this, you know, Mellors sees the upcoming child, that Connie is going to have as this kind of really fearful dread, a harbinger of bad things, because he's so terrified of the future. And so the culmination of their coming off together, it doesn't bring something that is loaded with fear, rather than something that is the product of their creativity. Talking about creation in this, the act of creation between man and woman doesn't fare too well. But so that's one point. But the thing about it being sort of revolutionary in terms of looking for desire, I mean, and then I don't know if anyone else has other points or other questions, but I think that the character of Mellors, Clifford is interesting, Connie is really less so interesting, but the character of Mellors is, because I think he is Lawrence, and some people have said that it's sort of like some of his works are quasi-autobiographical, especially Sons and Lovers, but that Mellors actually defies Lawrence throughout it, because even though he has this sort of horrendous dread of the future, and so many times is saying that life has been made empty for him, he is a man who is full of the possibility of creation. Connie sees that he's got books hidden away in his bookshelf that he's not made anything of, so he's someone who's interested in the intellectual life, despite him putting on this kind of gruff accent. The very fact that he forcibly inhabits the broad accent and then slips back into quite, at times, maybe not necessarily beautiful, but very eloquent English when talking to her fervently about, when he really gets kind of almost political, he leaves behind all the thas'ns and theirs and all that, and sort of speaks properly, as Connie might put it. And he's actually really kind of defiant, because I think putting Lawrence's political views of quite obvious distaste for the idea of mass democratic involvement, Mellors is the new world coming and the new threat. And if only Mellors was given the space to do something with his life, then all kinds of things could happen. Lawrence, I think, it's this tussle within him of, on the one hand, being sort of fatalistic and saying, well, I just want to live on this farm and I just want to fuck you and not do anything else and leave me alone, world. There's that, but there's also in him this flame, the flame of possibility. So if you're going to try and resurrect some kind of progressive view of the future from Lawrence, which I don't think is his aim, but if you were going to do it, then it's that, Mellors is this wonderful character who is, despite himself, sort of full of hate, but also vigor and possibility. And it's that kind of vigor and vitality that, yes, comes from his penis most of the time. That is the direction in which this new world is going to take off. Obviously, Lawrence dies in 1930. So, he doesn't know what's going to come in terms of the Second World War and all those things. But I don't think that necessarily matters. He can feel the dread of the future.
Ella, thank you. Now, it doesn't look as if anybody else wants to say something at the moment. So if we could somehow show our virtual appreciation for Ella. The final session, the Frank's plenary, is on at 2 o'clock. The link, I can say it, but hopefully Ella will paste it into chat, which is the boi.co.uk/Academy Zoom, and that will start at 2 o'clock. So with that, thank you everyone. That was a lovely discussion of a book, actually, which is far better than I perhaps remembered.